I'm very sorry to be appearing remotely. I had hoped to be there today, but I spent the last 10 days in New York getting funding for a new energy company. And there is, there is nothing that saps one's energy quite like getting funding for a new energy company, I got to say. And by the time I had completed successfully our negotiations with the large Japanese industrial firm that we are going to be funded by, I just did not have the energy to get up and fly to Berlin. I really felt like I needed to get home and regroup. But I'm very grateful that the internet makes it possible for me to almost be there with you today. And I'm sorry I haven't heard all of the speeches. The ones that I did were inspiring and I suppose in some part depressing. And I think really one of the things that we have to confront is summoning forth the energy of hope. There is no energy source more powerful and sustainable than hope. And we have a crisis in the supply of that energy on the planet Earth at the moment. And I think this would be a very bad time for us to suddenly run short of this massively renewable resource. If I were there with you, what I would do, and probably the only visual aid I would use, would be to come out with a large blank sheet of paper and draw a large circle in the middle of it. And that circle, interestingly enough, means zero in the West, and it means everything in the East. In the Asian world, that circle encompasses all things. And in the West, it encompasses nothing. And I think that there is at the heart of that part of the problem we have. And what I want to talk to you about now in closing is what economists call externalities. Externalities in economic terms are all those costs and consequences that are too diffuse in industrial production or other economic systems to be factored into the balance sheets and the profits and the losses. When I was growing up in Wyoming, which is a large blank rectangle out in the western United States to most of you, and has the unfortunate capacity to contain within its borders a very large percentage of the world's energy, at least of the sort that you can get out of the ground. Wyoming sits on about a fifth of the world's strippable coal supply, and may have under it as much as 30% of all of the methane that is easily fracked under present circumstances. It also has a very large oil and gas industry. And I watched as I grew up the rape of Wyoming by Exxon and Chevron and various other large institutions, Amex Coal, and saw the consequences of this and kept thinking about how we were living in the external part of their externalities. We were continuously suffering for their depredations and paying those costs ourselves in reduced land use, in reduced water quality, in reduced air quality. And subsequently, I became head of something called the Wyoming Outdoor Council, which wanted to take, and did to some extent, take a holistic approach to the management of energy resources in Wyoming. And we set up a state environmental quality commission and an industrial siting council, and considerably beefed up the way in which the energy companies had to pay for the consequences of their works. And yet, none of it seemed to be working terribly well because there was no direct line that could connect us to the consequence of various actions. The actions would take place and they would be diffused in this vast prairie environment where there were very few people to actually witness the daily ecological changes that were occurring as a consequence of those actions. And we took the approach that I think is the standard 20th century approach to this problem, which was we tried to regulate industrial behavior. We came up with very elaborate and punitive rules to make them feel some of the costs of their actions. These efforts were only partly successful because these were companies that had unlimited legal resources, and they were massively creative in coming up with ways to get around whatever constraint we might wish to impose on them. And eventually I started to feel a diminished sense of hope, which became eventually so diminished that I decided to go off to a completely different frontier and spent 20 years trying to keep the internet open and free with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, where hope was easier to sustain. Though even now, I think we see the kinds of pushback that remind me very much of what Exxon and Chevron and Amex were able to summon back in Wyoming. And in recent years, I decided that when I thought about what I wanted to leave to my descendants, besides an open, free internet, I wanted to leave a planet that was survivable. And I guess we all want to do that, but I felt like I wasn't doing enough to make that happen. And I started to think about how we can take those externalities, how we can take that circle and actually use it to close a loop. What dawned on me is that many of the things that become hazardous in the environment or problematic actually have value that can be put in a balance sheet, that can be put in a spreadsheet to analyze the profits and losses of an industrial enterprise. Carbon dioxide is a valuable substance, even under its present circumstances, which are underutilized. But when you think about what we use for fuel, we use hydrocarbons, which consist to a very large extent of carbon dioxide. And yet we are taking all of the carbon dioxide that is released when we burn conventional fossil fuels and release it into the atmosphere as though it were useless, as though it were a problem. And the consequence of this, of course, is now recognized everywhere but the United States to be at least global weirding. If we don't necessarily have global warming yet, we have pressures in the meteorological systems that are imposed by the additional climate-forcing gases that will cause phenomena such as happened in the Soviet or the former Soviet Union last summer with the heat waves around Moscow, and are happening with the droughts and heat waves in Texas. They're happening with the floods in Pakistan. And increasingly, these kinds of very extreme meteorological events will become, unfortunately, very normal. And that will probably be the case for all of our lifetimes and the lifetimes of many to follow us. We can make a difference in this system if we recognize that carbon is, instead of being a pollutant, is in fact a resource. And so one of the things that I decided to do was to start looking for ways in which carbon could be reintegrated rather than simply released into the atmosphere, could be used to make new fuel. And so with colleagues, one of whom was former director of the Exxon Advanced Research Project at in New Jersey, we came up with a system that extracts CO2 directly from the atmosphere in pure form so that it can be used quite efficiently in the creation of new fuel. And there are various ways to make fuel with carbon dioxide, some of them directly using Fischer-Tropsch. But the most efficient method is to capture the sun and to harness the energy in the sun to do this. So we have large floating bioreactors of algae that we feed pure carbon dioxide to. The algae bind the carbon dioxide, and they also bind another externality, which is the nitrogen that is released in sewage. Most of our continents are now fringed with dead zones that are the consequence of sewage or nitrogenous material being released into the ocean, somewhat treated, but not denitrified. And again, nitrogen is in this context regarded as a pollutant rather than a resource, in spite of the fact that nitrogen is very valuable when it's being used for fertilizer, and is also very valuable when it's being used to fertilize algae and to create a source for biofuel, which is what we ultimately intend to make of the algae. We have a system that involves captured hydrogen to take the biomass of the algae and turn it directly into diesel fuel, jet fuel, and gasoline. So that's what I've been spending my time doing, which is trying to close the loop, trying to take that which has been regarded as an externality and make it internal to the economic process. And I think there is in that system the spark of something that I believe all of us must be starting to think about if we're going to address this problem. Most of what I've heard today is about how we can be more conservative, how we can be more frugal, we can cut back. And unfortunately, what we're doing a lot of the time is wagging our fingers at everybody else about their energy use, especially in the first world, or what used to be called the first world, in the rich world, wagging our fingers at the resource poor in the developing world. There is the capacity in all of the things that we throw away to make such abundance that conservation will seem less a requirement and more a personal choice. And I think that we will be able to move from the depleting energy of preaching and receiving preachment into a world where we can start actually harnessing abundance and creating more out of what is already more. I want to also talk about the externalities that one sees in the financial systems as they are presently configured. Part of the problem that I had with Exxon and Chevron and Amex was that these are actually creatures. They appear to be run by humans, but that's a little like saying that a coral reef is run by coral polyps. They are actually ecosystems of intention and desire with a very limited lifespan and a very limited sense of the future. And their objective is to reap the maximum harvest that they possibly can. And you can see this not only in the field of energy, you can see this in banking, you can see it in corporate behavior all over the planet, where the corporations increasingly regard everything that is not directly in their economic interest as an externality. This is a short-sighted view, as we all know. But I think that the only way that we're going to fix that view is to make it clearly evident that the people they are cutting out of their processes are actually a form of energy that needs to be harnessed, that must be harnessed. We need to go forth and take everything that is now outside of that circle, that is considered to be an externality, and realize that we are on a very small rock in space, that Buckminster Fuller's notion of spaceship Earth is not just a conceit, it's a reality, and that we have to run this planet as a whole system, and it's easy enough to get institutions to do that if we can redefine the game so that it is obviously in their best interest to do so, not by regulation, but by economic incentive. So I think to the extent that we can start thinking about this in those terms, we can start thinking about giving the large corporations, changing their ecosystem in such a way so that it is to their advantage to look at the whole system. Therein lies the solution to many of our problems. And I hope that you can join me in your various ways in broadening that circle and making what is external internal and making what is separate whole. Thank you.